Yeah, so I agree. It would be good to align on specific language, because for me, like using the terminology of like a required pipeline, and maybe that's the benefit of moving toward like prescriptive pipeline or even prescriptive workflow, is it in theory doesn't mean that very specific thing, because ultimately what we're trying to solve for is, you know, organizations have a requirement. Okay, let me back up a little bit because I've had some epiphanies lately. So I talked to some of our internal team members who are former auditors from Deloitte, and I think a firm called Moss Adams. And so they were the auditors who came in and did the auditing of the exact things that we're trying to help customers solve for. And what I had an educated assumption about, but they helped confirm, was that when an organization says we need to have these jobs or these tasks that are carried out within our CI/CD workflow, it's because their organizational policies define that. It has nothing to do with the auditor, because the auditor doesn't come in and say, hey, look, like here's the checklist. They're just going to say, here's the framework that you're trying to certify against. Let me see the policies that describe what you say you're doing. Now let's audit what you say you're doing. And so talking to auditors is valuable in some ways, but largely this is a conversation, I believe, that it seems like we're trying to debate with customers who know their workflows really well, and they know the process and the reason those processes exist, right? Like managing risk, managing consequence at the end of it. So if they're telling us like, yeah, my policy dictates A, B, and C, and I need to make sure that that's implemented within GitLab, I understand why we don't want to implement it in the previous proposal because it's very disruptive, but we do have to solve for it. And I'm fairly convinced at this particular point in time, it is a matter of pipelines. I think in the future, as we start developing like best-in-class products such as scanners, like one customer's feedback was the reason we don't use at least GitLab's scanning capabilities natively is that it's not what we consider to be best in class, and so it's not worth the migration time and cost to migrate thousands of developers to a brand new product or functionality, because that's very costly for them. So in the interim, which is probably, you know, n number of months or years, we have to have some sort of solution, and maybe we don't like that solution, but it might be what they actually need. So sorry for the front-loaded context there, but I think it's important as well.
No, I think it's helpful. So to take a step back, how are your customers defining a pipeline when they tell you that they want enforcement in the pipeline? What are they showing you?
So the one customer I spoke with that I've referred to in the issue, I'm still waiting for them to send me over like that itemized list, but they did a non-recorded screen share because they had to get approval from legal to share it. But they basically pulled up, I think it's Atlassian's Bamboo product. And it kind of looks like a user-friendly UI version of a YAML file. They had this left sidebar that showed the different stages and jobs within the pipeline. So like they had a build and test stage.
Don't use the word pipeline to define what a pipeline is. I'm wondering like the word pipeline to define what a pipeline is. So if I understood what you were saying, it's a set of stages that code is going to go through in order to reach a target. Okay.
Yeah. So they had this set of stages, each stage with, you know, the respective jobs. The build and test stage had, if memory serves, maybe 5 or 6 jobs. And in their particular case, what they want to do is they say, we just want to have this set of stages in GitLab, and we want to make sure that that developers have 2 options. They can use this set of stages, and if they use that, then they can add stuff to it, and we don't really care what they add to it, because this like core set of stages is what we want to enforce and action on. If they don't want to use that, then we will let them create their own set of stages, but they have to come to us internally at our customer org to then seek approval to use that in their project.
Okay, that's helpful. So when I'm talking to customers about how their Jenkins is configured, which is another tool to set up series of steps that a code is going to go through, they have a very different way to permission access to change each stage inside of a Jenkins configuration. So for example, developers you can give them permission to only edit the build step, the test step, the environment line. Like each line in your YAML file has its own ability to permission in the Jenkins setup. So when we're looking at that expectation that users can come into GitLab and look at a YAML file and take a line and say, I only want my developers to be able to edit this line, that's kind of what we're up against. So our definition of a pipeline in this context is going to be a set of steps or jobs that a code is going to go through in order to get it to a target environment. As far as parent pipelines, is that just the template that customers are expecting to have as the gold standard that their developers are going to leverage?
As I think I understand that, yes.
Okay.
And that's terminology that they used.
Right.
That's terminology that resonated with them. And the idea would be that this set of steps is defined in some fairly global way that developers could then consume. Now, one important caveat there is that this particular customer wants it to be an optional consumable thing. They call it the paved road, but they want it to be optionally consumable, and then there's that backup approval process if they deviate from that paved road.
Yeah.
Other customers who are wanting the same thing in principle want it to be the de facto standard for that set of regulated projects, but also maintaining that developer flexibility to some degree.
So it sounds like this doesn't differ from a template inside of GitLab. So like when we look at the Auto DevOps template, it's an option that you can pull from your repository and set from a drop-down menu. So here, I think that the problem that we're trying to solve is allowing users to add custom project templates and have those be the only template options inside of the drop-down menu. But it also means that the developers can't go back and edit that template. They can only extend it, right? Okay. But a parent pipeline in GitLab is a specific set of stages within a project that then triggers a child pipeline. Mm-hmm. So from like a definition standpoint, we're not really talking about the triggering action, right? We're not expecting a child pipeline to be triggered. We're just saying that
it's
a set of stages.
Hierarchically upgraded set of stages, but yeah, does not have the triggering mechanism necessarily.
Okay.
And you know, one of the things to throw out there that I was thinking of was, well, maybe because how I broke it out into two problems, right? Like we have this definition piece, and then we have this what customers want enforcement piece. But like we can solve potentially for the first piece. It won't be the full solution, but it's at least an iterative step. And my initial thought was like, well, what if we, I think I mentioned in that comment, but like, what if we somehow apply the allow failure equals true to this like hierarchical set of stages to where it runs with every single workflow, but even if one or n number of parts of that process fail, the local pipeline or instructional workflow like still succeeds, and like the experience remains the same because you're still documenting it.
So you're saying that there's two pipeline files, this hierarchy that people can't touch, and then a separate pipeline that's in the same repo that you're expecting the developers to edit.
Well, that's how my mind is visualizing this. And when I described or like engaged with the customer about like parent-child pipeline, like, yeah, it sounds like what we need. And that context was the parent pipeline is this thing that you define, and the child pipeline was what runs locally in the project. I don't think that's necessarily the path forward.
Because the parent pipeline in this case has to exist in the same project. So It wouldn't be like a configuration custom path that then locks down a core file, and then the local project can then edit it. So I think part of the challenge that I'm having right now is that we're trying to like address a really broad set of use cases with this problem. And I'm wondering if there's ways to segment the use case and define like the 5 job to be done, 5 is such an arbitrary number, but like the handful of jobs to be done that we're trying to accomplish with what your prescriptive pipeline is called. Because what I'm hearing is seemingly something that we already do in GitLab today, which is allowing users to specify custom project templates.
Right.
And if they can specify custom project templates, they can do anything around allowing failures. They can say that these steps will fail your job. They can say that your merge won't happen because it won't happen to master. It has nothing to do with deployment to production. It's all about controlling each stage of your code going through acceptance. So I'm interested to hear if this is just about building out sample projects and templates and having customers like see those, or like proliferating like marketing about those different project templates rather than like building something new. Because I don't think we need to build anything new. We have the project templates already there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point. I think that would work for a brand new customer coming in and setting up their environment for the first time. I'm not sure that it applies to the customers who already have like hundreds or thousands of projects, at least not without a lot of effort to maybe go implement that change.
Well, all of them will have a change they'll need to make no matter what we build. Like even if we build a pipeline template, like you're still gonna have to go through each of your projects and apply that. There isn't gonna be like a universal setup there.
Yeah, and I think that's what they want as a universal, right? Like, so why I kind of brainstorm around this idea of something we define at the group level is because that's what customers have asked for, at least in kind of the forced includes concept. To me, as kind of like a relatively fresh set of eyes, it makes sense. And I'm not saying it's right, but like to me, it makes sense that why couldn't we have this group level experience where I can say, here are the jobs that I would like to have run for all of these like specific projects, and then kind of like tailor it from there. I'm sure that's not feasible. I'm sure there's issues with that or challenges, but like, is it plausible?
Yeah, I would say that we should probably evaluate a group template at like a group YAML file template. Really, like the way that GitLab works today is that YAML files are very specific to each repository, and each repository is project level. So we would be changing the paradigm of project-based resources to group-based resources that actually render project-based actions. So I think it's possible. I'm doing that on the release management side where we're saying, hey, we want to be able to manage releases at the group level, but really what we're doing is providing convenient paths to help users dig into the project from a group view. So we're creating that visibility at the group level, but actioning at the project level. For YAML files, my fear that we're having here is that we're going to implement them at the group level. People aren't going to use them because they don't have granular enough of controls at the project level.
Yeah.
So like, and then we're going to have to elevate a bunch of level of permissions or create a whole new permission structure to support people at the group level so that they're not able to do things at the project level. Because we just don't have that. That's not the way GitLab is. That's not the paradigm that GitLab has today. I don't know if it's actually solving the problem either. It does sound like when I was talking to another financial services customer, they just really wanted to not rewrite their Jenkins configuration set of GitLab. So the cost of having to rewrite and tool GitLab to match their current implementation had a really high switching cost for them. So we just have this barrier of wanting to just use things out of the box exactly how they currently have it configured. And I feel like that's probably what we're going to run into with all of these mature enterprise customers anyways. But I would say prescriptive pipeline, required pipeline, all of those are templates. Like those are just templates in GitLab. And the required and prescriptive part is permissioning. And how do we permission access to those? Because really, like, we're just saying that you have this template and we don't want people to edit the template.
So I think, okay, so let me write this down. So I believe that, yeah, like, so you're absolutely correct that I think a quick win, at least for one customer, probably for multiple, is um, like creating the capability where a project template can be or preloaded with a pipeline definition, like a YAML configuration file, right? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah.
So I agree with that. I think that's probably one of the smallest things we can do.
Well, and it already exists today. That's the beauty of it.
Right. And we're just
Right.
like kind of connecting some pieces.
Yeah. Zhuzhing it up.
Yeah. The technical term. I think so. So then from there, it's still kind of tackling the paradigm of like, how do we then make I'm almost traumatized to use the word enforcement, but like that's the reality is they want enforcement. But I think it already exists at the merge request approval, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and this is where enforcement of the stages at the merge request level, it just, you can build out linters, you can build out requirements that fail your job. It's kind of like when we're doing our release post stuff. And if we have an extra space, there's a linter that runs and fails our job.
Mm-hmm.
So like those are the kinds of things that we can help customers define and work out so that their jobs fail if they don't meet these certain style criteria. And at the merge request level, it's such a small change, but again, like we're thinking about what's the downstream impacts to developers producing code and value for their customers. So we do have to balance like how much power do we want to give people to block merge request progressions through stages. And that's this whole idea of we don't want to require people and slow down the process of deployment. But we do enforce this concept of managing the steps in approval through the merge request train. But the problem that I'm hearing is people are looking for like granularity of controls because they want to empower developers to build off of something that's a baseline, but they don't want them to edit that baseline, if I'm hearing correctly.
That is my understanding. I'm also pretty comfortable with not. So like I'm pretty comfortable with making things, at least in the CI part, fairly like smooth and passive, right? Because that merge request approval is the final human interaction to say there is or is not a problem with everything that's happened to this point. I'm gonna make a decision to approve it or not. I think then it's the CD part. Like one customer's example is after the merge, but before deploy, I think they run additional scanning. Like, does that even make sense? I don't know if I'm articulating that correctly. Like,
so typically what customers are doing, they deploy to multiple stages or environments. So they'll deploy to a QA environment. And once they get the final stamp of QA, it's going to promote to a production environment. And typically there's like a cleanup batch job that happens after that to like scrub the existing environments, redeploy new clusters, whatever they want to do, whatever their setup is. But it doesn't really mean that they're going to scan production again and revert that change. That's not really how people do things. They may identify a vulnerability in production and roll back to the last successful deployment. And it's a redeployment of a previous commit. But it's not typically, I want to revert this change after scanning. It's about redeploying an old thing.
Yeah, I'll have to dig into that with the customer I have in mind, but their comment was they have post-build checks, and
which
those
is
posts
not deployment.
Right, but does that fit between the merge request being like integrated and being pushed to deployment?
I remember
Production?
seeing, I'm revisualizing your diagram and mural.
Yeah.
Because I remember you walking me through that. So pre-build is going to be everything that's about creating the image and package. The developer is going to make their pull request. They're going to pull that image out from the system. And then they're going to make their changes. This is in the merge request. They're going to promote changes. They're going to merge those changes into their master branch. Once that master branch is complete, they're going to ship that to code review. So this is all in that post pre-build stage. So we're in the build stage. They're going to, that approver is going to stamp it. It's going to get merged into the master branch. That change will get merged in the master branch. That master branch is going to get deployed to a QA environment to get tested and stamped. So now we're leaving the build phase because it's been repackaged into another image for a production deployment. And now it's going to the test stage. The test stage is going to approve it, and they're going to take that master branch, cut it, deploy it to a production environment.
So it sounds like somewhere in the general vicinity of being deployed to the QA environment is where those scans or those jobs are taking place.
Right.
Okay.
It's pre-production.
Yeah.
Post-test.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that breakdown. That is probably the most clarity I've had around this in forever.
What's weird is that sometimes people have blue-green deployments. So they have clusters where they're rolling out changes to two versions, and they will run them in parallel. So they'll have the same version on it, or they'll be rolling over the new version to the green or blue lines. And that's where it gets kind of confusing, because technically both of those are production, but your blue version is getting the new version and the green is your old. So then you're going to...
So you have like a fallback option or failover in case of...
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they're both production.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I know we're at time. Do you have a hard stop here?
No.
Can I be selfish with your time?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
We're making such good progress. I feel like we should keep this rolling.
Yeah, I think I meant to schedule it for longer and I just didn't. So apologies, but
please don't be. You're fine.
So one of the next things I would love to have you participate in is there's a follow-up call for next week with the customer that I referenced in that issue. I think it would be valuable to have you on that call. I'd also like to have Tao on the call, but I saw she was out of office. I didn't check next week though, so I'll see if we can work around her schedule as well.
Kenny might be good too.
Okay.
He's your stand-in right now, so he might be a good person.
Gotcha. That would explain why his schedule is especially busy.
I know.
Because at the end of the day, I think what we've talked about here, as far as here's a project template. I think that solves at least part of, from now forward, here's how you can let your developers consume this configuration.
Right.
Presumably, the flexibility for developers manifests as they can make merge requests to update the YAML file.
Which isn't going to be sustainable.
Which is not sustainable.
Because that person, someone has to then maintain it. Yeah.
Could you, sorry if this is super ignorant, could you use the code owner's feature file to help mitigate that?
So it still will be it'll still have its own project. So this is where if you don't have a dedicated ops team, or you're running GitOps teams where it's all integrated, customers are going to push back a little bit, because they're like, we don't have the resources to not only maintain our application code and our infrastructure, but now these extra templates that you're making us uphold, when in another tool, I can say, developers, I don't want you to edit line 442.
Right.
So that's what we're going to be hitting up against, is this. I am trying to support 1,200 developers, and I don't want them to edit these 3 lines of code.
Maybe a conversation has occurred already, but it feels like if we had an experience where, and bear with me, but let's say in group settings, you have a page called pipeline configuration, just rough idea. And there you literally just paste your YAML configuration. Let's say this is the template that they want to use. In theory, we can maybe, we could have logic there, or split it up into separate input fields to say for this stage, for the how you can add rules, right? So you add a row. So this row is my verify stage, and I have maybe 3 items in there that are the locations of the scripts or runners, I guess, or the jobs I want to run. And so if we break it out like that, then we could feasibly say this UI element maybe is only visible to group owners, but like at the project level, or I don't know, but you could also maybe permission off of that to where if you have these input fields, that maybe gets compiled as a YAML config in the project, but then you can specify in the group setting like, oh, only developers can edit this particular line, like this particular element.
I think that giving granularity of like YAML configurations, I think would be really helpful for our users. One thing that we'll need to really look at is it's hard for our front end to parse a YAML file.
That's fair.
So it will be a challenge for us to understand, like when we implement something in the front end, how is that going to interact with the YAML file, and will it be able to pool those different lines? And then for YAML files that are particularly large, or YAML files that then reference another project, so that's the custom CI configuration path example, the system will need to kind of understand where to go to check that these permissions are actually like all in one place.
And so in Jenkins, is it a single file, but then there's just a separate mechanism that like delineates the specific line numbers that can't be edited? That's
the whole front end is really the configuration file that we have. So the whole Jenkins tool, the way you write it out, the way that you specify it, like it gives you the option to like protect, highlight, and identify what chunks of code you want to permission differently. It just doesn't, it's just not the same as having the super flexible, easy to use YAML file, but it does give companies the ability to granularly control the configuration.
So how, and I'm trying to find the documentation, but like how does forced includes work that it's such a detriment?
So forced includes allows users to specify several sets of steps prior to running a set of steps specific to a project. So for example, it'll say these set of actions have to happen before the next steps happen. So it might be that they insert those required steps after somebody has merged a change, but then say that these forced include pipelines have a reference to an image that is now out of date, or it has a library that's no longer secure. It's going to throw errors, and it's going to prevent you from deploying your change or even merging your change to master, because these are steps that are no longer relevant to you, but they're instead scanning the whole entire code base, not just your change. So that's usually the implication, is that forced includes will look at the whole application after this one change has been acknowledged or submitted.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like if there was just a way to make those passive to where they weren't a contingency, like they do run, but then at the merge request you see that, oh, these forced includes ran, but one of them failed, then the human is making the decision to block that progress, but it's not necessarily failing the whole pipeline, or like not preventing the rest of the pipeline from starting and succeeding. And it's not necessarily impacting negatively the whole pipeline. But it is still there. But it seems like that's the one nuance where there's no way to override or circumvent that because it's required.
Yeah. And I think that it can slow down things really, really bad when we look at build times. Say that you're submitting a commit to change a typo in the front end of an application. Now that forced includes is going to take those 3-character changes and run potentially minutes and minutes of scans for your 15,000 line code base.
Right.
That's where like this efficiency of running your pipeline, that change is only 3 characters, doesn't impact any of your tests, like everything's green. But when you hit that forced includes, it requires you to go through these steps that are not relevant to your change.
I see. That's really helpful context. And it makes total sense now, like after hearing it, was not aware of it before.
And that could be like a really immature way of like abstracting that application of forced includes. Could see lots of benefits for forced includes. Like, let's say that they only have it on tags, so you're only running forced includes on releases to production, or it's only on the master branch. When you use those rules, then the forced includes have become much more meaningful because it's restricted to just branches that are about merging to a change for a customer. But sometimes people are trying to catch those changes way upstream, so they're putting those blocks or those scans on every change to every environment. And that's where you can start seeing the slowdowns, the efficiency impacts.
And you know, I like to explore, because I know that we have deprecated or made the decision to deprecate force includes. But learning what I've learned, I feel like that's maybe not entirely necessary. So I just like to kind of do the mental exercise. But like, is there a way that we could just implement hard-coded blocks that say, oh, you can only, you know, designate force includes for like master branch or certain things?
Well, let's think about in CD applications when there isn't a manual check on that, when there isn't somebody that's like clicking a button to do deployment and it's running all of their jobs get deployed to production. People push at will. A forced includes will slow people down because it'll be scanning. You will have hundreds of thousands of pipelines running for all the changes of these thousands of developers every day. And each of those pipelines are going to run those scans because you're deploying each individual change to a production environment. So in a true CD world where people are pushing at will, forced includes becomes a detriment to efficiency.
And that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's in the current paradigm that they are this like disruptive required thing.
Right.
But if they were somehow passive and the person making the decision to approve that MR could see, oh, it's still running, but you know what, this is a 3-character change, I don't need to wait for that, I'm just going to go ahead and approve this.
Yeah, so when you make things passive, they lose their usefulness and people will likely not adopt those features because they're like, okay, well, why am I even caring about this if it's not changing my workflow, right? So maybe that's like me misinterpreting what we're meaning by passive. So like I could see us collecting this information with every merge request and surfacing a report to a customer being like, hey, you actually deployed 4 vulnerabilities to production. Here they are at, without blocking people's deployments to production, surfacing those things after the fact, or sending like a notification or a report after each deployment to master, from master to production, that says, here's all the things that we found. You may want to fix them. But again, like passiveness, it alludes to it being not actionable, right? It's just it's just happening. So do we really want somebody to be able to have forced includes and not have any benefit from it? Because that could be how it happens, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's, I don't disagree with that. It also seems like that's what we're trying to do ultimately, though, is have this like, you know, and I use the word passive fairly liberally. Maybe that's not the best choice, but like my understanding is that if we don't want to be disruptive to the developer experience, and if we don't want to be like blocking efficiency or velocity, then to me that translates to a more passive implementation. So like if being more passive leads to less likely to adopt, then I think there's maybe a disconnect there. But I think really what you're pointing to is if a customer says, I need this to be more active, then yeah, like it makes perfect sense. And even if something is passive, I think we should still surface those signals in the merge request or wherever makes sense. Like we should still be saying that even though you said, no, go ahead and merge this anyway, because you didn't want to wait on all those tests or jobs for this like really minor change, we should still in the merge request or in some other reporting mechanism show that like, yeah, these eventually finish 10 years later, here's like the output for that, and that should still be available. It shouldn't be like discarded or completely ignored. But that's what I'm trying to navigate, is like customers have been very clear that we want to block in certain situations. But I mean, I think we've pretty sufficiently covered all of the different nuance that makes it so tough.
Yeah. How is what we're talking about different than what I just slacked you?
Let me see.
Or just chatted you, sorry, not slacked.
I think how it's different. So like what we're talking about in premise, I believe is the same, in that they want to like include these required jobs. But what I'm trying to figure out is the way that I understand this proposal, which I think is like the forced includes concept, right? If a forced include exists and if it fails, my understanding is that the whole pipeline basically fails, or like the rest of the pipeline doesn't start. Is that accurate?
Well, forced includes is just like a job that then it's a command in your configuration file, but you can have all the other commands like before, after script, allow failing, retry after X, like they can use all the other commands within that forced includes job. Like it's irrelevant. It's so flexible that customers can have that, but still allow failure. So when I hear forced includes, like what we're trying to remove is the power to mandate that a developer go through something that doesn't necessarily benefit the end user, right? So someone can build out their YAML file and do all the things that you're saying, but this could be us being prescriptive with it. Like if you're going to use forced includes, you should allow failures. Like that's something that we can say that that's what we recommend, and that's like a documentation update. But I think it goes against with what we're trying to, what Sid is committed to, what we've committed to as a company, that we don't want to promote that behavior. But that's the problem with YAML files, is that they're so extendable and they're so easy to put whatever configuration you want in there. There isn't someone, just because you have a forced include doesn't mean you don't allow failures. Like people probably have that built out already.
Yeah, no, all of that is valid. And that's part of that mental exercise, is I'm trying to fit, like, that's why this is so difficult, right? Is because at the end of the day, customers want to block bad changes to production.
Right.
And at the end of the day, GitLab doesn't want to put customers in a position where they've created this workflow within GitLab that they are now bankrupt because they couldn't get something into production because of all of the forced includes or required jobs or whatever it is that cluttered up the pipeline. It also seems like this is something that customers want to run on very specific workflows. So like it's not an all projects thing, it's a regulated projects thing. And I think that's an important distinction as well. Not that lessens the impact or the potential consequence that Sid is concerned with, but it does, I think, reduce the scope, right? Like we're not talking about allowing customers to apply this to all 15,000 projects, only maybe like 10 to 50, depending on what their environment looks like. But yeah, I'm still just kind of at a loss on what the solution maybe looks like. But this conversation has been really helpful.
Yeah, I think part of this is understanding how people want to manage configuration for YAML files. Yeah. And I think that like that's the greater problem that we have to solve. We need to empower the single individual developer who's contributing with GitLab to their product. And we need to empower enterprises to be able to control those contributions. So those two things are inherently at odds with each other, because speed and compliance aren't always going to be seeing eye to eye, but we need to build our solution to meet all of those use cases. So from like a first iteration, I think we need to work with an SA or somebody who can build out a project that illustrates how can we manage a project template or configuration that then allows a developer role to extend that. And how can they extend a project configuration so that they use a baseline template and still allow their jobs to succeed. And I think this can be accomplished with parent-child pipelines, like you've mentioned before. This can be accomplished by a CI custom configuration path. This can be accomplished by building out a new paradigm for managing permissions by jobs inside of GitLab. But I think that that's the bigger compliance scope and problem that we need to solve. I don't think pipelines, I think we're being too myopic when we want to manage pipelines. I think we need to think about like bigger implications of how people are using GitLab.
Yeah, no, I think you're like the third or fourth person who said that, yeah, they want to basically bring Jenkins into GitLab, which I think is an important insight. I know that the Access group is working on, I believe, more granular permissions in the pipeline. I don't know what the plans are there, so I'll circle back with Jeremy and Melissa.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, your point is valid that we need to understand a more abstracted view of how they're wanting to work within GitLab. I feel that at least a handful of customers have provided exactly that insight, and that's largely what's kind of like driving this conversation from my perspective.
That's good.
Which I'm sure maybe sounds repetitive to anyone who might watch this video of like, no, Matt, we told you like no forced includes. Like, I know, but this is what I'm being told.
But that's where like we need to take a step out from what they're telling you and like really look at what their problem they're trying to solve. I think you took a really good approach by talking to the auditor people in our group, because really like now this is a change management thing of, hey, do we concede to customers and rebuild some functionality that's available in Jenkins into GitLab? Or do we decide that we really don't want to support these workflows? Because we can choose that that's not a worthy trail to chase, because then we would be building our product for an audience of highly configurable configuration items inside of GitLab, which is against our tenets of building something that's sustainable out of the box.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you say that, because I, at least right now, my opinion can and probably will change. It really feels like, okay, if we don't like what they're telling us and what the solution seems to need to look like, and granted, like I still need to do some more validation and research, but right now at this point in time, it feels like let's just commit that we're not going to build this, because we can tell customers, look, you're just going to have to build that custom tooling. If that's how you want it, then you need to build that. And we can maybe enable that with like maybe system hooks of some sort, or like event hooks and maybe API endpoints or whatever they need. And then provide them some guidance on how to build those types of things via professional services or solution architects, whatever.
Right.
But, Sid made a comment that I agree with, which is like, look, if they're trying to shove certain things into their pipelines, like let's take out what we can and build native features in GitLab. I agree with that. But the problem is one, we're still doing discovery on what exactly those are. The little info we do have suggests that it's all very proprietary custom stuff that we're now kind of back in the same point of like, are we going to build this highly customized feature for one particular customer? Maybe that's okay.
Right.
But I do think there are opportunities in terms of like evidence generation, as you well know, reporting, which is something that I can help with on an audit reports category. So there are elements we can pull out of the pipeline, but there's a lot of stuff we can't, that I'm aware of.
And I think that that's where the position we can stand here is, as a single platform, we're going to make your job as visible and as transparent as possible, but we're not going to build out your blocks. And since GitLab is so extendable, you should be able to layer the tooling that you want on top of it. But I do feel like we have the framework in place that if we were to get the right SA, the right professional services people to help build these projects and these use cases with us, then I think we can find a solution that will work for 50% of the regulated use cases. But as we start to uncover these super old enterprise companies, like we're going to hit all their cruft and all of their own organizational, bullshit. And that's what we're confronted by right now, is that they're expecting us to build out something that's their workflow that won't translate to our other customers.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like next steps is I'll try to talk to a solutions architect and include you on that call.
Yeah, that'd be great.
To see if we can start at least prototyping what a maybe solution looks like. And then I'll also make sure that you and I guess Kenny and or Tao are included in the call with the customer next week. I'll
Perfect.
ask Victor to help coordinate that.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you for this super good conversation. I appreciate everything that you're doing, and I'm sorry that it's been this long.
Well, I really appreciate more than words your contribution and support. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.